I'd like to welcome everyone who is listening and watching to this event of the Center for the Americas at the University of Oklahoma. Our event today is on democracy and elections in Bolivia. And of course, the elections in this case is plural because we've had 2 elections in 2 years. So there are 2 sets of elections that we might want to talk about at some point. And I'd like to welcome especially our featured speakers, Dr. Sarah Hines, Dr. Diego Escobari, and Ainara Moreno Mejía, whom I will be introducing individually in just a moment. So let me begin with our first speaker. Dr. Sarah Hines received her doctorate in Latin American history from the University of California, Berkeley, and lived in Cochabamba, Bolivia, for many years during the presidency of Evo Morales. Dr. Hines is presently an assistant professor of Latin American history at the University of Oklahoma and teaches courses on modern Latin America with a focus on the Cold War period, and she writes about modern Bolivian history. Dr. Hines' first book, Water for All, Community, Property, and Revolution in Bolivia, 1879 to 2019, will be published by the University of California Press this fall. She's also published in the Hispanic American Historical Review. And she now has a second book project underway, tentatively entitled The Art of Resistance, Dictatorship and Its Discontents in Cold War Bolivia. This is looking at the mid-1960s to the early 1980s. Dr. Hines will be discussing our question of democracy and elections in Bolivia, giving us an historical context and perspective from which we can understand what's been going on a little bit better. So Dr. Hines, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kinney, for that introduction and for organizing this panel and inviting me to speak. Thanks also to the 2 other panelists for your comments that I look forward to hearing this afternoon, and to everyone else who is joining us today. As many of you are aware, it has been an intense 16 months in Bolivia. In November of 2019, Evo Morales of the leftist Movement Towards Socialism, or MAS party, resigned as president of the plurinational state of Bolivia after weeks of protest against alleged electoral fraud and clashes between his supporters and opponents on the streets after the October 2019 elections, and also just hours after military officers suggested that he should. In the days after opposition Senator Janine Áñez assumed the presidency, and in the days after that, confrontations between state security forces and Morales' supporters ensued, leaving around 18 people dead and many more wounded. Then, of course, COVID hit in 2020. Áñez's interim government, in the face of the pandemic, delayed the presidential elections twice. They were finally held on October 18th, 2020, now just a bit over 2 months ago. In those elections in 2020, the candidate of the MAS party, Luis Arce, won in a landslide vote with 55% of the vote, bringing the MAS party, the Movement Towards Socialism party, back to the presidency. I'll return to all of this, but first I want to take us back to the early 2000s, the social movements and rebellions of those years, the presidential elections of 2005, when Evo Morales was elected, and his presidency as the first indigenous president of the country. So to start with those social movements, at the turn of the 21st century, Bolivian social movements staged uprisings opposing privatization, foreign control over natural resources, and other policies that increased the cost of living. Social movements saw the policies they opposed as stemming from neoliberal economic reform implemented by the national government starting in the 1980s, after the return to democracy from dictatorship in the 20 years previous. Neoliberal measures in Bolivia entailed drastic cuts in public spending, elimination of government subsidies, raising income and sales taxes, privatizing state-owned industries and public services, like the state oil and gas company, and privatizing public utilities like water. These reforms are very unpopular and hurt many people's livelihoods. This wave of protests began in the Cochabamba region in the year 2000, when a broad and diverse mass movement protested and then overturned water privatization in a period of about 5 months. This social movement victory opened a period of 5 years of social movement mobilization that brought down 2 presidents and brought Evo Morales ultimately through elections to the presidency. To go through those protests that happened in those 5 years quickly, in 2002, coca growers known as cocaleros confronted severe state attacks on their livelihoods and lives. In February 2003, a wide array of groups protested new taxes imposed by the government. Military repression against this tax revolt, as it came to be called, left 23 people dead. In October 2003, that came to be known as Black October, protests erupted against a government plan to allow a transnational corporation to export gas through Bolivia's historic enemy, Chile, to Mexico and then to the United States. Protesters in these mass protests in especially El Alto, outside of the capital of La Paz, called for renationalization of gas that had been privatized in the 1990s, called for refining it in Bolivia, and for using proceeds to improve living conditions. They also called for the refounding of the country through a constituent assembly. These demands came to be known as the October Agenda. In the face of these protests, state forces violently repressed protesters and killed around 73 people, injuring many more. That confrontation and the fallout of it forced President Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada to flee Bolivia for the United States, where he remains today. So this 5-year left indigenous revolutionary cycle, as some observers have called it, paved the way for the election of the Coca Union leader, Evo Morales, who became the first indigenous president in the country's history in 2005. Morales vowed to implement the October Agenda and other social movement demands, and activists called their agenda and the means they used to implement it the proceso de cambio, the process of change. In the 2005 elections, Morales was elected to the presidency with an unprecedented 54% of the vote in a multi-party democracy where there often have to be runoff elections. In his inauguration speech, he vowed to do away with the colonial state, to end 500 years of foreign plunder of the nation's resources, and to guarantee a form of autonomy for indigenous people in which wealth would be redistributed. He also vowed to restore state control over extractive industries like oil and gas, and to deliver public services like drinking water in order to provide for the citizens' well-being. And more generally, Morales and the MAS positioned themselves as defenders of the Pachamama, the Mother Earth, or the environment, and proponents of the principle of vivir bien, which means living well in harmony with nature, an indigenous concept. This was the first time a party other than the 3 traditional parties had won the presidency since the return of democracy in the early 1980s. So these traditional parties and conservative sectors of society more generally were quite threatened by his election and by the power of social movements and the indigenous majority that it represented. It's important to emphasize that the MAS was more than just Evo Morales' party, and this process of change was much broader than the MAS and Evo Morales himself. The supporters of this process saw this party as their instrument to restructure society in the interests of the indigenous, peasant, poor, and working class majority. So all of this sounds very good, but I'll say here, and I'll explain more later, that there was a tension in the MAS project from its outset, a tension between indigenous and community control of resources on the one hand, in other words, community autonomy, and then state-led developmentalism and extractivism on the other. So during Evo Morales' first term in office from 2006 to 2009, his government fulfilled many of his promises to the social movements. The government renationalized gas and oil reserves, renegotiated contracts with foreign oil and gas companies in order to tax them at higher rates, and thereby increased government revenues that they then invested in social spending. As a result of good management of the oil and gas boom during those years, the Morales administration coincided with high oil and gas revenues, prices, and therefore revenues. The percentage of people living in poverty fell from 60% in 2006, when Morales entered office, to 35% in 2017. So from 60% of people living in poverty to 35% near the end of his presidency. His administration oversaw a constituent assembly that passed a new constitution that refounded the state, or refounded the country as the plurinational state of Bolivia, recognizing the rights of Bolivia's indigenous peoples and nations, guaranteeing that the government would provide for the basic needs of its population, and enshrining respect for the environment in the Constitution. So during this first term, the main axis of conflict was between supporters of the process of change and their opponents. Or more, you could put it between the government and its supporters on the one hand and its opponents on the other. In these years, there was a real sense that right-wing elements might overthrow Morales. During the Constituent Assembly, opponents of the government and the assembly threatened assembly members and physically attacked Mas supporters on the streets of Sucre in horrifying racist attacks. And in these years, the Eastern Media Luna departments, as they're known, the eastern departments of the country, were threatening to secede and take all of the country's oil and gas reserves, and therefore the rents, the government revenues that came from them with them. In Santa Cruz, fascist youth mobs burned and looted social movement and agrarian reform offices. And in January of 2008, this activity spread to Cochabamba, where white, wealthy fascist youth mobs attacked coca growers in the streets, resulting in a total of 3 people dead, 2 coca growers and 1 sort of youth mob member. All of this culminated in a massacre in the Department of Pando in September of 2008, when anti-Mas militants attacked a pro-Mas march of peasants and rural teachers, killing around 20 people. All of these activities, many of which were quite violent, were part of the conservative right's efforts to undermine the Morales government and halt the process of change. But this massacre in Pando backfired for the right, leaving it discredited and leaving its power confined to the eastern departments, where actually the Mas's electoral strength grew over the course of the subsequent elections. After the discrediting of these violent opponents in 2008 and the passage of the new constitution in 2009, the Morales government began to turn away from its commitments to social movements and a politics of liberation in order to fashion a pragmatic neo-developmentalist state instead. That tension had always been there, but they're shifting more towards developmentalism and extractivism and developing the capitalist economy after the end of this first term. During Morales' second and third terms from 2010 to 2019, the main axis of conflict was between the Morales government on the one hand and the social movements, peoples, and communities it claimed to represent on the other. So now, in other words, that the Morales government has sort of won out in this conflict with the right, and in fact had made some significant concessions to business interests, agribusiness interests in Santa Cruz. There began to be a lot of tensions within the process of change between the government and supporters or former supporters who began to oppose many of their policies. The government began to pursue development and extraction with increasing abandon, contracting an Indian company to mine iron ore, developing massive new lithium fields, breaking ground on a dam on the second largest river of the Amazon, opening up protected areas to oil and gas exploration, and promoting deforestation of Amazonian lands for commercial agriculture, all despite concerns and protests about environmental and human impacts, and also despite presenting himself and his party and movement as the guardians of the environment on the international stage. Morales and his vice president, Alvaro Garcia Linera, argued that extraction was necessary to improve the livelihoods of the poorest and most marginalized Bolivians. And large numbers of Bolivians agreed, to be fair. But the residents of the territories where these resources and projects were located expected to have a say in these decisions, as Mas leaders had promised and as the new constitution of 2009 required. These tensions came to a head in the Tipnis conflict of 2011. The conflict was over the government's plan to build a highway from Cochabamba to the Department of Beni further east. And the planned route passed through the Tipnis, which is an indigenous territory that gained autonomous status in the 1990s, and that is home to 63 Moreno, Yucaré, and Chimane communities. And this project was also part of a much larger project led by Brazil to, among other things, cut a series of highways between Brazil and the Pacific. Despite constitutional requirements, the government failed to consult affected communities. As a result, Indigenous communities and organizations across the country went on alert. The Lowland Indigenous Confederation CIDOB and the Highland Indigenous Confederation CONAMAC organized a protest march in September of 2011. Several thousand men, women, and children set off toward La Paz to protest not necessarily the road itself, but the government's violation of their right to consultation. And what occurred next was shocking. On September 25th, 2011, 500 National Police cut off the march and violently assaulted marchers, beating them with clubs and firing tear gas while the country watched on TV. So this is the self-proclaimed first Indigenous government of the country attacking Indigenous marchers, the kinds of social movements and people who had voted for him and mobilized in the years leading up to his election. The government's response to the Tipnis March laid bare that when forced to choose between Indigenous lives, environmental protection, and ruling by obeying the social movements on the one hand, and state-led economic development and natural resource extraction on the other, the MAS would choose the latter. Morales, Garcia Linera, and their ministers were unabashed in their condemnations of the marchers and their supporters, charging that they were dupes or possibly conspirators of developed capitalist countries, regional landlords, and NGOs. So in other words, that these marchers were bought off somehow by the US empire or other right-wing forces. So anyone who opposed the government was branded as right-wing and supporters of the US empire. These charges were so nasty and absurd that many MAS supporters became incredibly disillusioned. Many have called the Tipnis affair a betrayal, and in many ways it was. But it was also a fulfillment of MAS's program of capitalist development. So moving forward to where things get to more confrontational, while the 2009 Constitution limits presidents to 2 terms, Morales ran for a 3rd term in 2014 on the basis that his first term didn't count because it occurred before the country was refounded as the plurinational state of Bolivia, before the new constitution was passed. But then Morales wanted to run for a 4th term, and there was no way to claim that this was constitutional. So to try to get around constitutional requirements, his government held a referendum in February of 2016, putting the question of whether he should be allowed to run for a 4th term to the voters. A majority voted no, but Morales used some dubious legal maneuvers to ignore the referendum outcome and run anyway in the 2019 election. As Vladimir Díaz-Cuellar put it, Morales and Vice President Garcia Linera considered themselves irreplaceable. It is worth noting that the Organization of American States Secretary Luis Almagro did not contest these maneuvers at the time. When the election occurred in 2019, in October of 2019, the atmosphere was therefore tense. The night of the election, the quick count vote was suspended for 24 hours. And when the count was posted again, it showed Morales winning by more than 10% of the vote, meaning he would avoid a runoff. The OAS, the Organization of American States, made a statement that suggested there had been fraud, and protests broke out, charging Morales with committing election fraud and demanding his resignation. The situation then became quite complicated. On the one hand, men on motorcycles were attacking women in Indigenous dress. They presumed to be MAS supporters on the streets. And nationally, and especially in the eastern departments, there were clearly right-wing elements trying to take advantage of this crisis to attack MAS officials and supporters and push Morales to resign. But those calling on Morales to step down also included forces who had supported the MAS and been part of the process of change, like union and Indigenous leaders. Morales' unwillingness to consistently rule by obeying them pushed many left and Indigenous popular forces into opposition, meaning that Morales' ouster was not simply a right-wing elite plot. Rather, a broad range of groups and people across classes, ethnic groups, and regions called for him to step down, including the leadership of the National Workers' Confederations, the national union movement. But not all popular forces opposed MAS in the 2019 elections or on the streets. It's important to remember that no one disputes that Morales won the plurality of the vote, in other words, the largest number of votes by a long shot, And it's important to remember that that number was 45% that he won. So the country at that point was very divided, including within the movement for change, the different movements for change that had originally supported the MAS. On Friday, November 8th, police in cities around the country mutinied, and on the morning of November 10th, top military brass went on TV, quote unquote, suggesting that Morales step down. So those who called it a coup in the aftermath of Morales's resignation did so because of this military intervention. The right took advantage of this opening to retake power. Luis Fernando Camacho, whose nickname is Macho Camacho, a lawyer and head of the pro Santa Cruz Civic Committee, marched into the unguarded presidential palace with a huge Bible, and Janine Áñez, whose party had won only 3% of the vote in the 2019 election, was declared president with no quorum present in the Senate to approve this move. So therefore dubious legally whether she should have become the interim president. Áñez had a history of making racist statements denigrating Indigenous people and their spiritual beliefs. After swearing herself in as president, she declared the Bible has returned to the palace. Just days after she became interim president, state security forces carried out 2 massacres, the first in Cochabamba in the Sacaba area, and then the second in the El Alto neighborhood of Sencata outside of the capital La Paz. Áñez then assured security forces that they wouldn't be prosecuted for potential human rights abuses, recalling the darkest days of Bolivia's and South America's dictatorships and experiences of state terror in the 1970s and early 80s. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights condemned these actions and deemed them massacres. Áñez's government is widely considered to have blundered in its approach to the pandemic, at one point purchasing 100 ventilators that didn't work for 4 times their value from a Spanish company. And she used her power as an unelected interim president to make policy, including reopening Bolivia's economy to transnational companies and opening the door to use of genetically modified crops. All of this pushed those who had been divided in whether to demand that Morales resign or support him back into alliance behind the MAS. So that explains and helps to explain why in the October 2020 presidential election, Luis Arce and David Choquehuanca of the MAS party won in a landslide, garnering 55% of the vote and avoiding, therefore, a runoff election. No one expected this. Many had thought it was impossible for the MAS to win at all with a candidate who wasn't Evo Morales, let alone to win in the first round. So why and how did Arce win? Arce had been the minister of the economy under Morales, so was widely credited with the policies that allowed Bolivia to take advantage of the oil and gas boom. Their electoral platform emphasized the economic crisis and promised a return to economic stability and growth seen during the Morales years. And they campaigned on the outside of the cities, where millions of previously poor people had joined the middle class during the Morales years, but where economic crisis induced by the pandemic had pushed large numbers of people back into poverty and food insecurity. They also learned from Morales's mistakes. Arce publicly criticized Morales and promised to promote new, younger leadership in the MAS, to govern for only 1 5-year term, and to restart the process of change. He also promised not to prosecute the police and military officials and personnel who were involved in Morales's ouster. And Arce benefited from a weak and divided opposition. The MAS remains the only party with a popular base nationwide. Even in Santa Cruz, Arce won more than 30% of the vote. The 55% of Bolivian voters who chose Arce and Choquehuanca voted against the violence of the ouster of Morales, against the racist attacks on presumed MAS supporters in November 2019, and again during the 2020 elections, against the violence of the Áñez government, and against the generally racist and derogatory depiction of MAS supporters and popular classes by the hard right in the previous year and for long before that, using terms like MAS hordes and public enemy number 1 and the cancer of Bolivia to describe MAS supporters. The MAS supporters who Morales had alienated were willing to make amends with the party and support it due to their common desire to stop the return of traditional elites to power and their desire to restart the process of change. So now that the MAS is back in the Palacio Quemado in the presidential palace, Arce and the MAS will have to show voters that his economic model can work not just in boom times, but also in times of crisis, and that they can deal with the coronavirus. The official death count now is around 11,000, and the real count is probably far, far worse. And due to conditions far beyond the Bolivian government's control, the vaccine is unlikely to be widely distributed there anytime soon. The government will also need to deliver on its promise to allow for new leadership within the MAS and deal with the tension that I've been highlighting between extractivist development on the one hand and community and environmental concerns on the other. And Arce's government will have to deal with the threat of the radical violent separatist right in Santa Cruz that's carrying out violence on the streets. Most of all, under Arce's presidency, the MAS will need to reestablish relationships and trust with social movements and decentralize power away from the national state, away from the national MAS leadership, and toward social movements and local MAS leaders. That will be necessary so that the participatory bottom-up politics that brought Morales to power in the first place can once again determine the direction of the process of change. There's a long history in Bolivia of social movements challenging the status quo and the power of elites. I'll end by saying that the MAS's victory in 2020 belongs to the social movements and the voters who voted Arce in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hines. That was very comprehensive, and you were able to cover a lot of territory in a very small amount of time, which very effectively. So thank you very much for connecting all of those points and giving us that overview. We're going to turn now to Dr. Diego Escobari to discuss with us the question of the evidence for and against fraud in the 2019 election. There's a big debate about this. And Dr. Escobari got his bachelor's in economics from the Universidad Católica Boliviana. He received his master's and doctoral in economics from Texas A&M University. He's published over 30 articles, mostly in finance and economics, winning various awards, including the Georgiou Rogan Prize in Economics in 2019. He's a member of the Bolivian Academy of Economic Sciences, as well as vice president and president-elect of the Society of Bolivian Economists. He's currently associate professor of economics and the doctoral director in the Robert C. Vacker College of Business at the University of Texas in Rio Grande Valley. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Escobari. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Professor Kinney, for the invitation. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time to talk about Bolivia. Thank you for your interest in my country and the democracy in my country. So let me quickly share my screen. So before I begin with my official slides, so this is Bolivia, right? So we're, let's say, the US up here. I'm here in south part of Texas. So now in Bolivia, Nara would be from Santa Cruz. I'm from La Paz. Evo Morales would be from the highlands here from Oruro, right? So that's and then we're landlocked. We had a war with Chile over 100 years ago, but we cannot get over this. So every time, and that's how I start my classes. So when I explain about Bolivia, I always talk about Chile. My roommate from the PhD was from Chile, and then he always washed the dishes because he felt guilty about the war between Bolivia and Chile. So let me talk about this paper that I have with Gary Hoover, that it basically looks at the 2019 elections. So I don't work on political science, and Gary Hoover, my co-author, he was in Oklahoma and he moved to Tulane, and he's also an economist, and we both work with numbers. So, but the type of research question is very, very closely related to what we do. So essentially, the way we ended up working in this paper was that in the night of the elections, so that was October 2019, this is the same as, let's say, when you're watching a football game and everybody's watching the football game, let's say the Super Bowl, every Bolivian was in front of the TVs and everybody was watching what's going on with the elections. So everybody votes on the same day, so there's no vote. Everybody was watching at the news, trying to figure out who's gonna be winning, okay, who's winning. And I, of course, I was in Texas keeping track of the elections. And then the system that keeps track of who's winning suddenly stopped working. And everybody was puzzled, what's going on here? And just 2 days later, there was an engineer from a and basically he had like basically multiple pictures of the sequence of how the votes arrived to the electoral court. And that's when I said, okay, this is data sets, and I have been working with data sets for 10 years. So I started working with these data sets to try to figure out if there's a way to test if there was electoral fraud or not. So that's how I ended up contacting Gary Hoover, who is an economist who I had met many years earlier. And we started working on this topic, right? So why should we worry about trying to find electoral fraud, right? Much about, oh yeah, Bolivia is kind of far, or Myanmar. So this is just a few days ago. There was a military coup in Myanmar, and the reasoning behind, okay, why did the military decided to take power? They said, okay, there was electoral fraud, right? So kind of a very similar story. And just November last year, I'm not going to go into the details because I can see this could be a very sensitive topic. In the US, there's basically two groups, one that said there was electoral fraud, one there was no electoral fraud. So the question is the following: is there a way that by looking at the data, can we figure out if there's electoral fraud ex post, right? Because ex ante, there might be some mechanisms where you can, let's say, send observers, check, let's say, the polling stations, but ex post, if you have the data, is there a way to test for electoral fraud? So that's what we set up to do with my co-author Gary Hoover in this paper. So that's what I'm going to try to explain in the following minutes, okay? So in general, this is difficult to test for electoral fraud because this is illegal, right? So if it's illegal, people will try to hide it. And in general, this would be similar to, I want to check based on the responses of students in the exam. Let's say I have the exams. Just based on the responses, is there a way I can test if they cheated or not on the exam? So this is kind of difficult, right? Just by looking at the exams. I'm not looking at how they were taking the exam, if there were any cameras or if they have like on the let's say below the desks. So that's something I don't know. Just looking at the exams, is there a way that I can test whether students on the exam? So something similar happens here. So just looking at the votes, just looking at the results, is there a way that we can test for the existence of electoral fraud? Okay, so that's what we're trying to do in this paper. So how is this important? It is important because of course, if there's fraud, there's less leadership turnover, and there's evidence that this is lowering economic growth. So it affects the behavior of, and of course, in Bolivia, it had dramatic consequences, right? Why? Because we had the elections, there were people claiming that there was electoral fraud. The country was paralyzed for 3 weeks. And then the Organization of American States, who was overseeing the elections, said, yes, there was some manipulation. They didn't use the word electoral fraud, but they said there was some manipulation. And the events that followed eventually led to President Morales quitting and moving to Mexico. Okay, so that was, you can easily see that fraud or no fraud, it can have huge impact on what's going to happen. The existence of fraud decreases accountability, and these are some papers that looked for fraud in different elections prior to this 2019. What's the background? So Sarah already highlighted the key elements here. So in 2006, Morales was elected for the first time. And I can say in 2006, I was happy that Morales was there. I was not voting because I was living already in Texas, but many of my very good friends, some of them that live in the US, they voted for Morales. And in general, even people who didn't vote for Morales, they were happy, okay? So why? Because they said, okay, probably we don't agree 100% with Morales' policies, but we're gonna give him the benefit of the doubt, okay? So the following years, Morales tightened his grip to power. He was an extremely, extremely popular president, okay? And one of the main reasons why this was the case, of course, it's because Bolivia is a deeply divided country, okay? So there's big divisions in terms of income. So there's huge disparities of income. And there's also big division in terms of the color of your skin, okay? So in general, if you're more, let's say, probably more indigenous, your skin is more gonna be darker. And there's a large number of papers that discuss about the effect of the skin on your, let's say, wages and so on and so forth. There's a huge amount of people in Bolivia who will vote for Morales regardless of what happens. So there was corruption in the following. So somehow, whether you're indigenous or not, it's gonna be a key determinant of your vote, regardless of the performance of the government, okay? Now, what happens with Morales is that he was extremely popular, and during those years, he nationalized the oil industry, and this led to, there was some changes in the taxes, and this led to huge increases in the revenue. So in the 90s, there was a privatization of the oil industry and a number of industries as well. But the privatization of the oil industry led to huge inflows of foreign investment. And basically there was a lot of oil and gas. They discovered started exporting gas to Brazil and Argentina. And what happens in Morales' presidency is that the of gas and basically of oil, which is linked to the price of gas, they were extremely high. And suddenly the government had more money than ever before, and not just a little bit, it was 2 or 3 times larger than just 10 years earlier. So Morales was basically the president during a huge economic boom because of huge economic growth in Brazil. So Morales was very popular, and he implemented a lot of policies that were trying to help the poor, and a lot of them Morales' presidency. There were a lot of corruption scandals, which was nothing new because Bolivia has a long history of corruption everywhere. Every government that gets into power, they'll always have a lot of corruption. So Morales was not different than previous governments, okay? And people were just okay with it. So people were still voting for Morales without questioning that much. Probably bit, some of the voters was that the fact that Morales wanted to stay in power. And the story, the 2006 constitution didn't allow for a re-election. So he changed the constitution to allow for a single re-election. And in 2009, we basically changed the name of the country. It was Republic of Bolivia, and now it's Plurinational State of Bolivia. So they changed the name of the country, and basically, he resigned, saying, and Sarah mentioned it a little bit, because the country switched, he basically said the first presidency didn't count. And because he was very popular, he was still okay. That the constitution, that he was already running for a third time, okay? So referendum, there were even additional corruption. Surprise, he lost. So, which basically meant he couldn't run again. In Bolivia, there's 4 different powers. So there's the legislative. He was in complete control. Basically, the Supreme Court basically ruled out that Morales could run in his human rights, which of course makes absolutely no sense. I mean, why would anyone, let's say, run against the referendum just because it's supposed to be a human right? So that was already very, very 2019 election. So what happened in the 2019 election? So voting occurs on a single day. That was a Sunday, October 20, 2019. And the rules are a little bit special, okay? So there's 2 ways in which you can win. You can either get 50% plus 1 of the votes, or you. But the distance between the first and the second needs to be 10% of more, okay? So the forces basically meant that this was the critical path to win, okay? So Morales, it was kind of clear he was not gonna be able to go over. The key question is Morales get more than 10%, okay? And people already knew that this was gonna happen. So pretty much everybody voted for Comunidad Ciudadana, that was Carlos Mesa, the second one. So people knew that Morales was very unlikely to cross the 50%, so they kind of agreed to vote to push the second one. So a lot of people who otherwise would have voted for, let's say, let's try to vote who position to compete with Morales, okay? So the night of the elections, this was a key element. The counting system, this Dept, basically stopped working at 7:40 p.m., okay? And at the time it stopped working, the margin was 7.88%. So that was still below the required 10% difference. And it resumed over 20 hours later. And by the time the voting system started working again, Morales had over 10%. So of course, that was extremely suspicious, right? And there were a lot of explanation of trying to explain what happened with the votes. Some of the explanation was, oh, it's the votes from areas, right? So Morales has in the rural area to arrive later, and that should be able to explain the difference. That's what proponents of the no fraud theory or hypothesis said, okay? One key element is that votes arrive online, so there shouldn't be any reason why votes from the city or from rural areas. But that's essentially the idea in this paper. Try to test if there's electoral fraud with these unique circumstances in the. So after the election, there was a lot of protests. So this was already summarized by Sarah. So at some point, the chief of the military suggested Morales to resign. So after protest, after the OAS report, after the Organization of American States report that said that there was intentional manipulation, serious irregularities, and protests that basically paralyzed the main cities for 3 weeks, the chief of the military suggested Morales to resign. And that's how a lot of people read this as a coup. Resigned and left to Mexico. And what is very important, and I think would go against the idea that this was a coup, is that the new president followed the constitutional line of succession. And as soon as the new president came into power, all political parties, including MAS, who had majority in the Congress, they all agreed to call for new elections. So it's of course, depending on the definition of coup that you were using, it might or might not. So, but at least it doesn't look to me like a coup, because as soon as the new president came into office, they called for new elections. Okay. So now, what happened the night of the elections? So the kind of data. So I have data from multiple sources. I don't want to explain too much about all the multiple sources, but the key ingredient that I have that other papers don't have is that I have the exact minute at which the polling station, the results of each of the polling stations arrived to the Electoral Court. So there's one paper from Hidrobo who has a similar data set, but it's missing about 4% of the data that arrive at the end that we do have with my co-author, okay? But this is very interesting, because if you look at what happened in the 2020 election, so you're more familiar with the US election, yes, there's some states that flipped, right? So if you were looking at Georgia, yes, the Republicans were winning, and at some point it flipped, and then it was the Democrats were winning, right? And there was some reasoning behind, right? So the idea was, okay, there was voting by mail, and at some point they started counting the votes that arrived by mail, and then it flipped. So the story here is kind of similar. It's basically the votes arrived to the Electoral Court, they were counting the votes, and Morales' margin was not big enough to win. And then there was a shutdown of the system. The system stopped working. And when it resumed, suddenly the results have already flipped, okay? So this is from the point of view of, let's say, a researcher that works with numbers. This is like very good news, right? Let's say I have, let's say, I'm looking at this from the perspective of, I'm a researcher who wants to test for hypotheses. So this looks awesome, because this separates the polling stations in two different groups. The group of polling stations before the shutdown of the counting system, and the polling stations after the shutdown of the counting system. How is this important? This is important because in research we have the treatment group, a group that is more likely to be contaminated with fraud, and a control group that is less likely to be contaminated with fraud. So that's essentially what we're using in this paper to test for the existence of fraud, which is very interesting, and which is essentially the same thing that happens in other types. Let's say the effectiveness of a COVID vaccine, you're gonna have, let's say, 500 individuals, and you're gonna give the vaccine to this group, but that's not enough. You need to have a control group, right? So you're gonna have a placebo and have the vaccine or this placebo given to this control group, and then you're gonna see the differences in, let's say, infected, let's say 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month later, right? So you're basically looking at the treatment group, okay? So that's essentially the shutdown of the system allowed us to separate polling stations into two groups. The treatment group, the fraud treatment group that was most likely to be contaminated with fraud, versus the control group, okay? So now when looking at the data, we basically have, so I have my magic pen here. So, oops, let me check. Oh, I don't see my pen. Oh, it doesn't matter. So I'm just gonna point with this. So this is the, let me check, it's strange. Yeah, no, I don't have my pen. So anyway, so this is the votes for Morales, MAS. This is the political party that was running second, and at the results, you can see the distance between the first and the second is over 10%, right? So essentially, Evo Morales won the re-election, right? Now, this is before the system shut down, and these are the votes after the before the shutdown. Morales was getting about 45% of the votes, and after the shutdown, it went up to 54%. And the ones who were running second, before the shutdown, they were getting about 37% of the votes, but after the shutdown, they were only getting about 29% of the votes. So there's clearly something strange there, right? Because in general, again, the votes arrive, the results of the vote arrive online, right? So there's no reason why, there's no reason to believe why there should be one type of votes arriving faster than others, okay? So, but still we're gonna try to test for different alternatives. So the easiest way to test is this is regression analysis. So this is just a little bit of advertisement. So if you're working with the statistics or with the econometrics, this should be very straightforward. But essentially here is, we're just comparing the before and after and how the shutdown affected the votes, okay? So in principle, this is the number, basically the gap between Morales and the second increased by 16% because of the shutdown. So this is big, right? This essentially should be zero, but for some reason it increased the gap. So this is very strange, right? And some people might say, okay, because there's a chance that the polling stations that arrived after the shutdown might be different than the polling stations that arrived before the shutdown, okay? So one criteria is, okay, they arrive online, but yes, okay, let's try to test if the differences between might explain the difference, okay? So in a second approach, we basically use what it's called difference in difference. And this figure is basically to show that indeed Morales has more support outside the big cities, right? So this is a map of Bolivia. If you look at big cities, you will usually see bigger bubbles that are usually closer to orange, okay? Why is orange? Because the color of the mesas, the second political party was orange. So I'm using the same official colors of this political party. So essentially what this figure is showing is that smaller dots are typically blue, bigger bubbles are typically orange, to try to illustrate the fact that usually Morales has more support outside the big cities, okay? Now, so this is, econometrically speaking, we use what it's called the fixed effects to control for these differences, okay? But one additional identification strategy beyond is using this difference in differences, okay? So what is that we do in the paper? We're going to be using the constitutional referendum. So this is the 2016 constitutional referendum. And the question that voters needed to answer is exactly the same. So essentially in 2016 and 2019, voters needed to answer the same question. And the question was the following: do you want Morales to stay as your president? And in 2019, if you wanted to say yes, you voted for Morales, for Mas, right? And in 2016, if you wanted to say yes, you just voted yes. So the question is essentially the same in the referendum and in the 2019 election. So we're using the 2016 as what we call an additional control group, okay? So this is interesting because we're dividing in 4 different groups. We have after the shutdown in 2019, before the shutdown in 2019, so this is the easiest control group, but now we take what it's called the difference in difference. We additionally look at the 2016 election to see if the 2016 election can predict the path, right? So I need to summarize this in the most intuitive way possible, at least based on my understanding of the tool, is the following. So yes, we have some trends of how votes arrive to the electoral court. And the question is this trend, can this trend be explained by the votes in 2016? So that's essentially the idea, okay? Sure, the gap has been decreasing. And the question is, can we explain the change in the trend with the votes from this previous referendum, okay? Now, more technically speaking, this is what is called difference in difference. And this is the question that we estimate. And the results are basically in this table, okay? So the number here, it's smaller than the number that we had only looking at the 2019 data, okay? Which basically means that, sure, the gap between the first and the second increased, but the 81.8% of the increase can be explained by the referendum, but there's still an 18.2 that cannot be explained. And that's what we, following the literature, this is what we claim it would be fraud, okay? So it runs under various assumptions. One assumption is that there was no fraud in the 2016 referendum, okay? So there's some people that say there might have been some fraud, but we say, okay, under the assumption that there's no fraud in the 2016 election, and we know that there's some trend in the 2016, if we eliminate this trend, if we subtract this trend, what would have been the resulting gap, okay? And this is where we estimate that the 18.2% of the difference shouldn't be there if there were no fraud, okay? So that's essentially what these estimates are showing. So for this, we basically match one by one, polling station by polling station from 2016 to 2019, okay? Graphically, the blue dots are the 2016 referendum. The 2019 elections would be the red triangle. This should run parallel, okay? We know that Morales lost some popularity between 2016 and 2000. Red triangles are below the 2016 results, okay? So, but in principle, you can see how the shutdown, the distance disappears, the gap disappears. So at least graphically, this is consistent with what we have in the results. We should have observed that both lines should be moving somehow parallel, but it appears that at the end, the distance disappears. So this graph is consistent with what we find the results, that using the 2016 election to control for the trend, we see that we cannot explain how the shutdown has affected the results, okay? We also have, I'm kind of running out of time, we also have an additional test that is called the difference in difference in difference. And here we use the results of the votes for other political parties, because it was just Morales and the second one running, there were other political parties. So the question is, did the shutdown affect the voting of the other political parties? So that's we use this even additional control group, and the results are consistent and show that. So the trends of other political parties couldn't explain the changing trend in Morales votes, okay? And the last piece of evidence that we found is that this is called regression discontinuity. In general, yes, there has been, let's say, an upward trend, right? So this is the gap between mass and CC, the gap between the first and second. And the jump, I mean, you shouldn't observe a jump, essentially, okay? So it should, if there's any, let's say, trend, it should be smooth. So there is some, some motivation to explain that any discontinuity might be coming from pressure to change the results in the polling stations that arrive at the end. So these 95, we're using this from the OAS report, and we found this discontinuity. And in both cases, in this regression discontinuity evidence and the difference that we had before, we found that there is evidence of fraud. So just 30 seconds more. So there is 2 main papers that found that there were no evidence. So one, it's a little bit old. They were using a data set that is not that good, but this is more interesting because they use almost the same data set that we use. But the reason why they find different results is that because they are missing 4.4% of the polling stations. So we have a little bit more. So this data that we show at the end, they don't have most of these polling stations. So they're missing part of the data that is critical to find electoral fraud. And that's kind of the main reason why we believe they find different results. They also use the same tool, but they found no discontinuities. And that would be very, very quick, the end of my presentation. I don't want to run too much over the time of the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Dr. Escobari. I think that was very interesting. I should have mentioned early on, and I meant to mention after Dr. Hines' presentation, that for those listening, please use the chat to ask questions, and we'll try to get to those questions to the extent that we can. But right now, we're going to turn to Ainara Moreno, who is an international student at the University of Oklahoma, majoring in economics and international development. She's a member of the Honors College and has focused her coursework on Latin American politics, Latin American economics, and finance. She has an upcoming internship in global markets operations analyst at Goldman Sachs, and hopes to work for a period of time here in the US after this, but wants to return to Bolivia to get involved in politics. Right now, for reasons not connected with this, she's actually speaking to us from Bolivia. So thank you, Nada.
Thank you, Dr. Escobari. Thank you, Dr. Kenny and Dr. Hines. Dr. Hines, you gave an amazing historical and chronological context to all the issues. And Dr. Escobari, as an economics student and someone who studied econometrics, it's an incredibly interesting research paper you have there. And I would encourage the attendees to read it when they have time. I guess just to add a little bit more on, and I know someone asked a question on this, but to add a little bit more on this title I have on, which basically says Bolivia, country divided. And it is true, it has been divided by class, by race, and I think that Dr. Hines was right on the spot when she was talking about that kind of pushback to neoliberal multiculturalism and the power the elites had and the disenfranchisement of indigenous communities. It did at the beginning and like during the elections, these social movements had meant a lot. It meant for indigenous communities and other people to feel like they finally had a voice in a country where they felt that they weren't listened to. And there's obviously traces and just we still see the traces of like these previous elements of just inequality currently in Bolivia and its privilege that cannot be remain unacknowledged. But I think that one thing that is worth noting is that Evo, just in my opinion, did a lot of what Trump did in terms of race. It kind of like triggered more animosity. So obviously indigenous communities and other people that associated with indigenous communities, they finally felt empowered, and they felt a lot of them felt like Evo gave them that power to just finally like lash out. And I think that Evo did trigger a lot of violence towards like elites and also towards like just white people in Bolivia or like people of European descent. And I think that it definitely wasn't for the best. As far as like just touching on a few things that Dr. Hines said and just with regards about coca unions and their their position and their how they relate with the social movements and violence. I do think that there were mobs on the right that did incite violence, but coca unions, like they weren't all social movements for the people and peaceful. Like that's not the case. In fact, coca unions, like it's been known in the country that the coca plant is produced and in the majority for the production of cocaine, not just like the medicinal and traditional use of coca. Apparently, I don't have the specific statistic, but somewhere about 90%, somewhere about 10% of the coca that's produced in Bolivia is actually used as like just the regular normal use. So that other 90% or 80% around those lines, that's going towards like trafficking and drugs. So, I mean, the fact that these coca unions are supporting more coca growing, like that's just it brings up ties and questions and it's just suspect towards like drug trafficking. So whether they're nonviolent is questionable. As far as just what was going on after the elections, they called it like 21 days protest, where Dr. Escobari spoke briefly on the topic. Or basically the main cities kind of shut down. I wasn't in Bolivia at the time, I was home, but it was just something I'd never seen before. Every road was blocked, no one, and this is popular in Bolivia, roadblocks is kind of just a way of showing the government you're unhappy. And the workers' union, like several other social movements, use this tactic. It's normal. What was unnormal about this is it was just protesting an election. It came from the right, which it didn't usually come from, and it lasted for like a very long time. Imagine like 21 days where no one moves. It stops the economy. It's kind of like a very strict lockdown. Now that we have COVID, it may be easier for you guys to imagine, but you can literally, the roadblocks were everywhere. And I can say for myself, like my parents and my friends, like I don't know a single person that did not participate. And that might just be the people I associate with, but it's also, I guess, reflective of how deeply just people feel about it, regardless of whether it's like 45% or 55%, there's a significant portion of the country that disagreed. And there's a significant portion of the country that felt that there were things that were going on that were not okay. And there were a variety of reasons for this. Dr. Hines talked about it, like it was, I guess, like moving away from like protecting the environment, protecting the interests of other social movements, allegations of corruption, a million other things that I will speak on briefly during this presentation. Well, this is not working as well as I thought. I'll just skip presentation. Okay, so one of the claims about Evo Morales is that he's the first indigenous president, and a lot of outside media or like foreign media has talked about Evo Morales being the first indigenous president. That's just, in my opinion, untrue, because I don't have his name here, but he's Andres de Santa Cruz. He was, if I remember correctly, the second president of Bolivia. He was actually from a Spaniard father and an Amerindian mother, so who had roots to like Inca royalty. So I guess like people like to use Evo Morales kind of being the first indigenous president as some sort of propaganda. But I do think that's an important thing to point out. Then about the coup, or people say like attempted coup in Bolivia, or what's apparently a coup. Like there's a lot of people that disagree, at least here. Was there a coup? Was there not a coup? A coup d'etat, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is a sudden, violent, and illegal seizure of power from the government. And here in The Economist, it's basically an article that kind of argued, oh, the army actually did what they were supposed to do. They were protecting the Constitution. You're not really supposed to, go for four terms. Like that's not okay. And I found this little, I guess, like cartoon very interesting. So they said it's kind of like portraying the idea of a self-coup. So I think a lot of people go for the argument that, Evo Morales, through the power he had during the government, he was actually trying to steal the government. It's kind of hard to think about it at first, but he was going through illegal measures, not only through fraud, but also using state resources for propaganda and using other influences. I think Dr. Escobari talked about this, or Dr. Hines, like Evo Morales kind of had a free-for-all like power over the judicial and the Supreme Court to kind of like let him do what he wanted, even like classify going like for as many terms as he wanted as a human right. So a lot of people kind of see it that way. This is another article that I read, kind of like the self-coup idea. And so this talks about the 21 days of protests. And this kind of touches on kind of the animosity that I was speaking about in the beginning, where people feel divided. This little video is situated in El Alto. And this is actually people that came from the interior of the country, like kind of like the Andes, people that live in the countryside. And they actually gathered in El Alto to protest people that were protesting in the city, saying like, we're not gonna let people pass through the roads. And they came in from the interior, from the countryside, and protested and came in as it was basically a mob, if I can play it here real quick. And they were kind of screaming civil war, if we can get it to work. I think you got the idea. There was a lot of damage. Like this picture on the right is of the public transportation buses. They were burnt and completely destroyed. If I remember the headline correctly, it was 72 buses that were completely destroyed. This were paid for by the state, by Massa's party. It was kind of, I guess, uncontrolled violence. I have family in La Paz that was affected by this. I know that a lot of people put white flags, and even the Huipala flag, which represents the Andean indigenous people, kind of like just as a sign to like the mob that came in from the countryside, and just tell them, hey, like, we don't hate you, we just want peace, don't come into our houses. So a lot of people did that, but they still burned a lot of supermarkets, pharmacies, the buses. There were people that had smoking inhalation because they were afraid to leave their homes for the night, because it was just a night of insurrection. I guess another thing worth noting about those 21 days where people were protesting the electoral fraud was that since the cities were roadblocked and Evo Morales, as mentioned by Dr. Escobari, had more support in the countryside interior of the country, he basically said he was going to organize countryside people to kind of like roadblock and not let food into the cities, kind of like a siege. And the police and even a Colombian kind of investigative audio unit confirmed that this was Evo Morales' voice. And here he is in this video basically saying,
Hermano, tenemos 2 puntos de bloqueo ya.
I'll go exactly where.
Cada grupo.
So he's telling people here to organize.
Es para mucho tiempo. Si uno se concentra, se cansa, la gente abandona. Se organiza el grupo, se turnan cada 24 horas, vamos a aguantar el bloqueo.
Sí, hermano, estamos de retorno, hermano, pero con esa cantidad de personas, hermano. Cambiamos turno, hermano.
hermano, generen comida a las ciudades, vamos a bloquear el circo de verdad, ¿no? No me acuerdo de cuando me expulsaron del Congreso en 2002.
Sí, sí.
So here where he says que no entre comida en las ciudades, he's just saying like, don't let any food into the cities. So he's basically like making like a counter move to the protests, trying to like leave the cities without food. People were really, really mad about this. And I mean, it's still, I guess, like the Bolivian prosecutors and like that Colombian investigative unit, like specialized in audio, they confirmed it was Evo Morales' voice. Personally, I've heard him all my life, or most of it, like that sounds like his voice. But you know, you never know. I guess this is like, these are other cartoons I have. So Evo Morales was actually similar to Trump in the way that he tweeted. And I tried to get his tweets, but he deleted them. I know there's like some backhanded way to get them, but there was a lot of inciting violence, and this was not like Trump's tweets. This was actually explicitly inciting violence. One of the things here, we see this little caricature, and you can read it. It says, como en Venezuela, milicias armadas. That's asking for, like in Venezuela, armed militias. So he's trying to get people to get arms and you know, like firepower. Bolivia is not like the US, like guns are not allowed. You have like, it's very rare. Obviously, because of drug trafficking, there's people with guns, and usually, well, what I've seen from videos is a lot of like coca union farmers were sending out videos of coming into this, like threatening coming into the cities, saying that they were with like rifles and AK-47s, which are completely banned. So obviously, it's kind of contradictory to have a country that says that those guns are not allowed, but then you have the president saying, hey, like you have to form armed militias. Like where are these guns coming from? If you apparently don't support, them, and they have to be coming from somewhere. So this is actually a picture from the plaza, like the principal square in La Paz. So the previous video where you saw like that mob, here they were trying to get into the main square, and I guess like the goal was to storm the main government building, kind of like the White House called Palacio Quemado. And here you see cops that at that time had supported the protesters that were roadblocking the city, saying like, we're not with Evo. Obviously, like they're scared because this mob is coming in, and they're waving a white flag signifying peace, and they're waving a huipala. And I actually saw this live, and basically you see these cops, like they're not, a lot of them are from indigenous origins. And actually these cops, when they were on live television, they started speaking Quechua and Ainara, saying like, we're not against you. Because initially what triggered this mob is that someone apparently stepped or like put the huipala flag, which is this like colored flag, on fire. It's representative of the indigenous people, and apparently that's why they were so mad, and they came in on a mob. The police got them to stop. This was not like the Senacta or Sacaba massacre, which, I mean, there's a lot to be said about that, and obviously it's horrible, the amount of people that died, but this was thankfully stopped peacefully. But in something that often goes unsaid about what happened in those 21 days where people were protesting is that 3 people did die in Santa Cruz at the hands of mass supporters. And one of them was an ex-guerrilla member of El FARC, which is from Colombia, obviously, ties to drug trafficking and ties to El MAS. So that kind of, I guess it's a stretch, but it kind of brings up the questions of why is someone from El FARC connected to El MAS, and why is he killing the protesters. So that obviously escalated things. People felt like, there was just, I guess, corruption in ways that like, it was just unabashed corruption. Here we have a couple more cartoons that were made. This is this little pig says Entel. That's like the state-owned phone company, kind of saying like AT&T, but the government owns it. So it's just basically kind of critiquing the amount of like corruption that's going on in the country. Obviously, Dr. Escobari mentioned this, and even Dr. Hines, corruption has been a disease of Bolivia even before El MAS and even after, during the transitionary government. And I think it will continue to be regardless of the opposition leader. But obviously, it's just, it really doesn't matter left or right or what kind of ideological position in a country like Bolivia. It just feels like it's just going to happen. And obviously, this is one of the reasons people were so upset. Then this is a more recent cartoon. And I think something similar happened in Brazil, but I may be incorrect. Evo Morales was a huge soccer fan, and obviously in Bolivia, people are huge soccer fans. So he built so many like soccer courts and stadiums and that sort of stuff. And that kept people happy, but right now we are seeing that we have a massive lack of public like health infrastructure. Like it's not okay. Like I think we have a worse investment in public health, in like just general health infrastructure in Haiti. And a lot of people are critiquing like, okay, he promoted all these like soccer games, he built all these soccer things, like maybe he should have built a hospital. But I guess like that's just things that happen in Latin America as well. Then just briefly talking about the caso falso terrorismo, it's a fake terrorism case. So this case basically, according
to interrupt, but you need to bring this to a close, so we have a couple times for suggestions.
Yeah. So this case basically alleges that there were opposition leaders in Santa Cruz that were trying to kill Evo Morales, and then Evo Morales killed like four European alleged hitmen, and then he basically had like 26 opposition leaders exiled to Brazil. But apparently it's claimed that it was just a thing that the MAS made up to make these opposition leaders run away. And it's been finally closed, and like these people that were on exile are back because apparently they didn't do this. But I guess just to close this up, I'll talk a little bit more about these flag dilemmas. This picture on the left was taken in El Alto. That's someone stepping on the Santa Cruz flag. And then something about the interim president, Janine Áñez, she added this white flag that I'm pointing at with some red in the middle. That's a traditional flag of the indigenous communities of the east, so of like the Santa Cruz Beni region. So when Evo came in, he added the huipala, but he didn't add that other flag because the huipala signifies the east, the Andean region communities, like indigenous communities, but the west, like the west indigenous communities weren't represented. When Arce came back, he took that away. So it's not only like a class thing, but it's also a regionalism thing that I'm trying to like show in this slide. It's more of like the MAS party represents this certain type of indigenous community, but not this other kind. And it's caused a lot of polemic and a lot of like trouble in both sides. Like there's people that have been arrested for taking down the huipala and putting like the other Patuhu like flag up because in Santa Cruz, because obviously that's representative of the indigenous people of Santa Cruz. And I guess my last slide that I did want to touch on, this is Janine Áñez, and this little rope signified the people that were the pititas, which is what they called, the people that were trying to protest this electoral fraud. And most people I talk about feel that Janine betrayed it with corruption, with the way she handled COVID, with the different like other allegations and things she did wrong, which a lot of people attribute to the reason why Arce won by a landslide, because she handled the whole situation horribly. There was an economic and health disaster, and she had a lot of like corruption scandals as big as Morales. So that's just my take on it, but I'll pass it on to you, Dr. Kenny, for the questions.
Okay, so we actually don't have very much time here. So I'd like to do two things. One is that there is a question that is directed to Dr. Escobari, and I'd like him to respond to that briefly. And then I'd like Sarah Hines to maybe end this, although there isn't much time. But in essence, the people who followed you, Sarah, were able to talk about what you said, and this would give you a chance to say something in response to what they said. But Diego, the question was, if you could just clarify, the observation is, wouldn't you expect in a country like Bolivia that voters to be divided by class and race? And so the question is, what is the difference between what you're arguing and just the common set circumstances that people vote differently, often according to class and race guidelines? You're on mute.
I'm just looking at the question now, so let me make sure I understand what it's being asked.
If you want to, I don't know if I could jump ahead to Sarah. I don't know if this is unfair, Sarah, but what maybe, okay, you can answer it? Okay, go ahead.
Oh, no, it looks, that's correct. So there is deep division in Bolivia, and it's racial division. There's division in terms of income. And what we do in the paper to control for this difference is that the region is divided into polling stations. So there's over 5,000 polling stations. So in the paper, we take the difference. Let's say if you voted in 2016, so polling stations have about, let's say 150 to 180 voters. So if you were voted in this particular polling station in 2016, you would vote exactly in the same polling station in 2019, 3 years later. So the idea in the paper is that we control for any potential differences that might be driving these voting preferences by taking the difference between 2019 and 2016. So if there's any characteristics that led you to vote for Morales in 2016 based on your, let's say, income or your race, your gender, or then those same characteristics will lead you to vote for Morales in 2019. So the idea is that we control for those factors in the paper. Let me show you one of the slides that it's very interesting. It's that, and this is actually motivated based on Hidrobo, that is one of the papers that basically said the last name of the voters should explain the voting patterns, but they didn't have data on the last name of the voters. But what is interesting is that we were able to get data on the last name of the voters, and we then compared the 2016 referendum and 2019. And this is interesting because, let's say, if you are E like me, like Escobari, then you were more likely to vote yes. So if your last name starts with E like me, you're more likely to vote for Morales, right? And of course, there is some indigenous last names, right? So there is, for example, Yucra, that would be, let's say, one indigenous last name. So the last names that start with Y deeply favor Morales, and that happened in 2016 and also happened in 2019, right? So probably if your last name starts with N, you're less likely to vote for Morales. So this graph just shows a little bit about probably some of the characteristics of the voters and that how those might have affected voting. But in the regressions, we control for these differences what it's called by including this polling station fixed effect. So even if we cannot observe some of those factors, we eliminate those. And the question is important because, yes, your level of income will affect how you vote. Your race will affect how you vote. And by including this polling station that is basically aggregated at, let's say, about 180 voters. So I don't know who I still don't know who you voted for, but I know within your polling station, let's say within the group of 180 voters that voted with you in the same polling station, that is basically your neighbor and someone who has a last big, and people are organized based on last names, I will be able to control for most of those differences. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And Sarah, if you could kind of close us out here with a few last comments.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you, Diego and Ainara, for your really interesting presentations. It was really interesting to hear where your perspectives and where you're coming from. And just a couple specific things and then sort of a larger point. In terms of fraud, I mean, I've read a lot of the different studies and literature and news articles about this question of whether there was fraud or not. And it's very polarized, as you know, as both other speakers are talking about. There was no fraud or there was fraud. And I think that we'll never fully know the full story. And I think there are deeper questions there of why, when there were some irregularities, it seems that there was an explosion of organizing and violence for 3 weeks, and that ultimately led to Morales's resignation. It's because the country was a powder keg because of all the different dynamics that we've been talking about of there being this polarization between left and right for a very long time, and in different generations playing out in different ways. And then there being polarization within the movement for change, and people's ideas and their support or lack thereof changing for the MAS. And Morales's clearly unconstitutional moves to run for a 4th term. But I think that the OAS played a very irresponsible role in the statement that it released on Monday, October 21st, 2019. I have it in front of me, but I won't quote it for you. I'll spare you. Just sort of suggesting, insinuating that there had been fraud, but very unclear, how extensive. Were there just some irregularities, or was this a concerted campaign directed from La Paz for Morales to win? Very unclear. It does seem, even though, as to respond to something specific Diego said, even if the votes are all submitted online, that doesn't mean they're all submitted at once. And they were submitted, it seems, more slowly from the rural areas than the urban areas. So it does seem very plausible that explains the difference between Monday and Tuesday. We saw that 2 months ago here in the US, how things could change really dramatically over the course of a few days in our election. So, there was this broader sort of frustration with continuism of Morales that was really genuine on the part of many people, and then that certain right-wing violent elements took advantage of and commandeered in order to force Morales to resign. And there's a lot that we didn't get to talk about. And a lot of what Nara said is really important about the abuses of MAS supporters in those 3 weeks. There were also extremely violent acts on the part of anti-MAS, organized groups on the streets that were, for example, in a MAS mayor who was they poured red paint on her, they forced her to strip. Really horrible things, threatening and attacking Morales's family members. So why is it that not just Morales resigned, but also his vice president, and then everyone who led Áñez to be the next person in succession, someone who had, her party had 3%. That is because of the degree of violence on the streets that was not limited to one side or the other, that then led Morales to resign, and the OAS playing this role. I think probably in a different situation, we would imagine there'd be a process. Everyone agrees that Morales won a plurality. The question was whether there should have been a runoff or not. So there could have been either another election to determine that, whether there should be a runoff or not. There could have been a closer investigation of the votes, but there were right-wing mobs that were burning ballot boxes and polling stations. So if they really wanted a recount, then why were they burning? And of course, that wasn't just, it wasn't orchestrated by this. There wasn't just all one group that was on the right that was directing things either. That was not the case on either side. And then just responding to what Diego said about Indigenous people voting for Morales no matter what, I think that we should really question that, because Indigenous people didn't start voting as a bloc until the late 90s, early 2000s. And the numbers in the four now different election, or we could call them five, election campaigns from Morales's four election presidential campaigns, and then the most recent one, the numbers have really changed from 54% in 2005 to over 60% in 2009 and 2014, to then only 45%, that Morales got in 2019, and now again 54%. And that's not just, it's not only that urban people or mestizo people's ideas change, Indigenous people's votes and ideas change too. And so I think this comes back to the question of the legacy of the MAS and what we should say about that. And as everyone's talking about, it's complicated. It's not simple, like black and white, good and bad. But the MAS, I think we need to give credit where credit's due. Brought Indigenous people and women into ministries, and not just as ministers, but into actual ministries in terms of the staffs of the ministries, and not just in La Paz, but in municipal governments and state governments. There was a real democratization of bureaucratic power, and those are real jobs in a country where there aren't a lot of good jobs for people, especially if you're poor, especially if you're Indigenous, especially if you haven't gotten the kind of education that we are all lucky to have gotten. So that was really huge. And just having someone who identified as Indigenous, who came from an Indigenous community as a president of the United States, was symbolically huge for a majority Indigenous country. At the same time, the pressures on that, both pressures from outside and things that they couldn't fully control, like living in a world where you have to produce profits in order to have rents to pay for social uplift. And also things like Nara was saying that were real decisions, like why spend only money on certain things and not on the healthcare system? And there were better decisions that could have been made along the way. And so there were limits also to that process. And ultimately within this movement for a process of change, there became sort of two polarized, two visions. One of working within the system to try to help think people as much as they could through extractivism and state-led developmentalism versus what water war leader Oscar Oliveira called the social tapestry of community systems built from below. And I think that there's a lot of hope here because we have, thankfully the 2020 election was decisive. Arce won a clear majority. There's no question about that. And I think there's a real opportunity here for the MAS to rebuild itself from below, to be more democratic. There are some signs that it is, some signs that it isn't so far in these last couple months. And for the social movements to regain their autonomy and to rebuild that social fabric from below, and frankly isolate politically again these more right-wing, these ultra hardline racist right-wing elements that were able to co-opt a very understandable feeling of frustration and frustration with continuism of Evo Morales. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending and for your presentations, Diego and Nara.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hines, for giving us a kind of a closing to something that, of course, is enormously complex, and we've only just scraped the surface of. But if nothing else, those who are listening to this and perhaps who knew little about Bolivia before coming to this event will understand how important it is to begin to understand the peoples and places of the Americas on their own terms and in the depth that they deserve. So take this as an introduction for something that we could continue this discussion. There's another interesting question about the role of the media and everything that happened. I'm sure we could go on an hour or so about that. But we're going to have to draw it to a close here. So I'd first just like to thank Stephanie Sager, who from the College of International Studies helped support and make possible the events that we're doing here. But most especially, I'd like to thank our three speakers, Dr. Hines from the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Escobari from University of Texas, Rio Grande, and Moreno Mejía coming to us live from Bolivia. So thank you all for participating, and thank you all who are listening and watching this for having participated as well. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank
Thanks,
you,
Dr.
everybody. Thank you, Sarah, Nara, Charles, for your interest in Bolivia, for your participation, presentations. Very interesting to know your point of views, your insights. Yeah. So, and of course, everybody who took some time to join us in this discussion.
And I would say if anybody has further questions, we can send emails to Dr. Escobari, Dr. Hines, to Moreno, Nara Moreno, if we have further questions. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.